Welcome to topic 5 of our subject, intelligence analysis. You'll notice that topic 4 was a series of getting familiar with different analytical tools and some exercises attached to those. There were no presentations like this, so that's why we're jumping now to topic 5, just in case you need to follow along. So topic 4 was really putting some skills together. Topic 5 is looking at some of the contemporary issues and problems surrounding intelligence analysis, data collection, and those particular areas. And so in looking at this, we will cover 3 themes, and they're very broad themes. And in some ways, this is really just a tip of an iceberg. I mean, whenever we talk about contemporary issues or problems, it's one of those things that could go on for quite some time. But I've chosen a couple here just as a way to introduce an ethical dimension to what we're doing, and also, looking at and revisiting some of the issues about data collection that we've spoken about in previous topics. And then the final part, or the final theme, so to speak, is handling information, looking at classifying information, some of the do's and don'ts. On the Interact site, I've compiled a few clips to complement your understanding. There's also some readings there as well, so they should assist in you understanding this topic a little bit better. So, as I say, the main themes are the ethics, some general problems with data collection and analysis, and finally, how do we handle information, particularly sensitive information. So they're the areas that we'll look at in this topic. Now, the first thing we need to keep in mind are some of the ethical frameworks in intelligence gathering, and there's a lot of information out there and a lot of voices wanting to be heard on this particular issue. I think I wanted to make this point. Given the mystique around intelligence gathering and analysis, particularly in collecting information, there's a real idea that it's amoral, meaning it's that getting intelligence, the ends justifies the means. So it doesn't matter how you get it, whether you get it ethically or not, it seems to be okay. That's really the broad thing. I suppose you get that from looking at a lot of James Bond films or, any of the ways that I think intelligence has been, put in fiction and so forth. But we do live in societies that have oversight, and rightly so. So particularly in liberal democracies, it should be expected that there is a degree of morality and ethics involved in intelligence collection and analysis. And it's worth thinking about that as we go through our practices. So I would like us to make that leap, make the initial leap and be able to express that intelligence collection is not an amoral behaviour. Rather, it has guidelines and expectations. Now, these expectations come from the agencies themselves, often informed by governments and regulation, and those government regulations are occasionally, and more often than not, informed by public expectations. So intelligence collection is not living in a vacuum. It's not a rule unto itself, but rather it's part of a broader societal element. It's a broader societal ambition or defence or so forth. So it fits in. That's my point I'm trying to make, in that it shouldn't stand outside of any sense of morality or ethics. Obviously, and we'll come to this in a moment, there are things of just cause and so forth, but we need to overall respect that there are limitations and sensitivities that need to be addressed. And that leads us to that sort of next point. Once we've made that choice or that understanding that there is a degree of code of conduct and ethics involved in intelligence gathering, other questions, specific questions begin to emerge. In particular, as point 2 suggests, is that surveillance in today's day and age is massive. It's everywhere. And we've covered that on and off in this subject. I just want to revisit that a little bit and ask ourselves these questions. You know, the establishment of things like DNA databases, the idea that we can monitor internet traffic, we can also track people's spending, we can track people's locations. We are living in a very big age of surveillance. The question to this is, to what end, is it for? In some liberal democracies, there is an expectation of privacy. There's an expectation that privacy is part of the overall human condition, and that humans are entitled to privacy. But for the most part, whether it be in the name of law enforcement, military protection, defence rather, any number of those type of well-meaning reasons need to be balanced out and weighed against the expectations of privacy and the expectations that in a liberal democratic society we would be entitled to a degree of privacy. And I think as we've progressed with our technologies and as we've had the ability to do things, seldom do we actually ask if we should be doing them. It's beginning to change, I think, as people are becoming more aware of the numerous avenues of surveillance, that people are now starting to think about their privacy probably a lot more now than they may have done 5-10 years ago. So surveillance has become an incredibly big part of our day-to-day lives, and it even goes down to CCTV cameras and a whole host of different issues. So there's always going to be a tension there between or a requirement for a balancing act to what is a fair and reasonable amount of surveillance of a population to ensure security, and what tends to lead therefore into a violation of privacy. And that becomes a real ongoing issue. And that leads us to our third point, where we talk about this tension between liberal democratic freedoms and intelligence gathering. Most people want to go through their day-to-day lives with a degree of autonomy and freedom. Now, we know that terrorism, the threat of terrorism, has changed remarkably the way that not only intelligence operates, but many of us operate in our day-to-day lives. And I guess particularly since 9/11, those early years of the 21st century, people were quite open to giving up a lot of their democratic freedoms in favour of security. And that seemed to be an acceptance amongst many in the Five Eyes particularly, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the UK, where the people were willing to give up some sense of autonomy in exchange for protection. And so that tension is always there. And of course, those that are in law enforcement, those that are working for government agencies, for national security and so forth, would be saying that many of the surveillance, many of the security measures that take place, whether they be in airports, over the internet, a whole host of areas, are well justified and needed in order for them to do their jobs effectively. And for the most part, that's probably right. But it doesn't hurt from time to time for even those agencies and law enforcement to question what impact these measures may have on people's autonomy or their liberal democratic freedoms. Because at the end of the day, law enforcement, military are set up to protect those particular freedoms, to provide us security so we can enjoy a sense of autonomy and enjoy a sense of freedom and privacy. And I think sometimes that gets a little bit lost. I mean, obviously in our operational sense, we want access to as much information as humanly possible. And we can see why. It makes the job a lot easier. But again, these things need to be balanced against public expectation and against what I guess measures are really needed and what aren't. And so that becomes an ongoing type of public debate, but nevertheless one that even intelligence practitioners should indulge and think about from time to time. And so when we look at intelligence collection and privacy, we can see that if we particularly expand into the commercial sense, we've talked a lot about predictive analysis, particularly in topic 4. We have even a closer look at it. I think we did in topics 3 as well. It's really about gathering information on people and assigning that sort of sense of, well, what may they do? Now, you'll notice in topic 4, there's a clip there that talks about policing and predictive analysis and some of the problems that it's causing in terms of what some are arguing is racial profiling and a few other issues. So there are concerns, I think, about people's privacy and also the impact of what that intelligence collection can have on someone. So let me just break this down a little bit. In regards to the commercial sector, we know that things like Google and Facebook collect vast amount of data on our movements and our shopping habits and so forth, all done in the name of knowing and being able to cater products and so forth for people. For the most part, average people just tend not to pay too much attention to the information that they're giving out and so forth. Nevertheless, I think that as practitioners, as we gather intelligence, we need to be mindful of privacy issues, and again ensure that what we're collecting is of particular use to our operational objectives or our research or our intelligence requirements. And so again, we're talking about that sort of balancing act. And I suppose a lot of the way that we try and manage that balance between liberal democratic freedoms and the importance of gathering intelligence is what they term as just cause. Just cause has a deep philosophical discourse. But for our benefit, we need to think about just cause as being, is it worthwhile doing what we're doing? So is it worthwhile creating a DNA database? Is it worthwhile monitoring internet traffic in order to stop a threat of terrorism or to stop a threat of criminal activity or so forth? So it becomes on whether it's the right thing to do. And I suppose just cause also goes to what lengths can intelligence agencies or even commercial intelligence organisations go to gather information? At what point does it become unjust to gather information? And a lot of it's got to do with the way that people view war. I mean, we've heard the cause of a just war. Well, it's a similar sort of thing. Thomas Aquinas had referred to just war being, in some ways, it's a product of something that you have to have, that there is probably something you've done wrong to cause that war. That's what Aquinas would suggest. Others say that a just war would be about security, about defence. So if you're defending your nation, your interests, then that becomes just cause. The only issue there is that when are you really defending, I suppose, your nation, and when are you being more offensive and so forth? And that becomes very difficult because the notion of just cause can really be, in many respects, subjective. And so I guess the driving force about what I wanted to talk about in regards to ethics is that it's not an easy one. It's not an easy road to try and talk, particularly in the field of intelligence, and given the background and the nature of what it is and what it is that intelligence collecting and analysis is about. So look, there are just a few points, and look, it's a very deep area, and I encourage you to undertake some private reading on it, particularly if you're interested in it, but it certainly is something that I think all practitioners need to keep in the back of their minds as they go about their work. Now, the next section I want to talk about is a little bit less philosophical and more about revisiting some of the things that we have when we're dealing with data and some of the problems. Now, we know with data collection, particularly in today's day and age, it suffers of two things, and they almost seem quite contradictory, but it is what it is. Too much data and too little data seems to be an ongoing problem with data collection. How much to collect, how to filter out what you don't need, and so forth, is an ongoing issue with data collection. And as we've talked about in other topics, a lot of it boils down to really understanding what your research, your intelligence requirement is. We also, I guess, the only other problems that tend to emerge with data collection is that difficulty of dealing with irrelevant data and weeding out the irrelevant data from the data that's particularly needed for your work. And we know that an ongoing problem, again, is conflicting data. How do you manage data that says one thing and other data that says another? And I think a lot of that goes back to verifying your data and checking it against other data sources, and we've talked about that. I brought these up again because I think that when you move into your practice, when you're doing this on a day-to-day basis, sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes it's frustrating to find the information, finding too much information, how to deal with it. By bringing this up again and hopefully keeping this in the back of your minds, it may save you from tearing your hair out and have an understanding that these things do exist. That it's, it's just not about you, but rather these are ongoing problems of data. And so, if we're aware of these problems as we go about our data collection and our data analysis, we're more equipped to deal with them and more equipped to work our way through those particular types of problems as they emerge. Now, with data analysis, we see that finding comparison data can always be difficult. So, in order to do to validate your data, often you need to compare it to other existing data. And we know, particularly with fusion data, it becomes very problematic in trying to compare it and get that. Finally, data identifying patterns. It can be difficult sometimes to see patterns. And so the challenge is always for us to be mindful and taking those steps back to identify those particular patterns. And choosing the right analytical tool to manage that data is always important as well. Knowing whether a qualitative or quantitative approach is working, knowing whether to use a SWOT analysis, a pest analysis, risk analysis, all these type of different approaches will assist you in interpreting the data. And there's nothing worse than using the wrong analytical tool to look at data. It's problematic. And finally, how do we deal with our evaluations? It's important that we make sure that our conclusions aren't ultimately going to be in error. And again, it goes back to making sure your data is as accurate as possible. We've got to make sure that the intelligence product that we give is in on time. And finally, we've got to make sure that it's relevant. How do we make those two factors count? Well, first of all, with the timeliness, is to make sure that we have a clear understanding of when things are due and when we've got to get the process done by, and making sure that when we're looking at data, it fits those particular time constraints or time moments. Finally, relevance. Well, that drives us then back to looking at the intelligence requirement and how that intelligence requirement is met by the research. And so we're always checking the relevance of the data. We're always checking the relevance of our conclusions and our outcomes to that research, that intelligence objective or that intelligence requirement. So that's just a brief review of some of the problems associated with data. And I suppose in many ways we've covered those throughout most of the topic. But as I said, it's always good just to reflect on those again and keep that knowledge that these are problems that are ongoing and they're always going to be apparent in the work that we are doing. Finally, I want to talk a bit about handling information. A lot of places will have a clean desk policy, which basically means you don't have any papers left on your desk of an evening and so forth. There's an expectation, particularly in the private sector, that documents are kept in a metal filing cabinet, that documents are increasingly these days that documents are destroyed when the intelligence is gathered. In the private sector this is. So there's all these little different things, and each organisation, each company is going to have their own handling policies and confidentiality policies and so forth. But I'll just talk about a couple of things to be mindful of. First of all is classification of data. Now, most organisations, we know the military have it, top secret, unclassified, all that type of thing. The private sector also does. It will have information that's, for in confidence or not. And so it's important that for whatever organisation that you're working for or with, that you're aware of their classifications. In some examples, just to give you a sense, is that a grade 4 classification in some areas may be seen as something of general or unrestricted nature. So if you're hearing that this is of general nature, or it's a classic, or it's a grade 4, it's probably unrestricted, and so the information is something that you'd probably even put in a company prospectus, or it's public information. The next level would be a grade 3. Now, a grade 3 is pretty good information that's usually just given to clients upon their request. It's information that can be disclosed, but you really wouldn't want it disclosed to an adversary or competition in some form. It may do some limited damage. A grade 2 information is really only available to those that are most important in terms of customers, or most important within your unit. This information, if disclosed, could probably cause serious damage to an intelligence unit or an organisation, and so a grade 2 is of reasonable importance. And finally, obviously the most sensitive is going to be grade 1. Now, grade 1 is usually on the old-fashioned need-to-know type of basis, and within government departments, it's only those with the appropriate authority that would be allowed to look at that information. And if that sort of information was to be get to adversary or whatever, it would have some grave, described as exceptionally grave damage to the organisation. And so it's usually only staff that has authorised access to that sort of information. And at times too, you'll find that that type of information will have a chain of custody record. Now, for those of you that don't know, a chain of custody record is basically a documentation that says who's had it and how long have they had it for, and they keep a record of who's been looking at documents and so forth. And so it's at that grade 1 level that you see that sort of data being looked at. And so the classification of data is very important, particularly so you know the sensitivity of the information that you're dealing with, and so those classifications help us do that. Now, I guess talking a little bit now about how do we look after information that's in our custody while we're working with it. And as I've said to you, most places at the end of the day will have a clean desk policy. I'm not sure that's actually at this university, but I do know some at the end of the day you're not supposed to be leaving things out. Most universities these days, particularly student records and so forth, you don't leave them open on your computer, you don't leave the printouts on your desk and so forth. And so there are shredding machines down the corridor, and those sort of security things have taken place. So within places, I mean, the thing to do though is if you're using restricted documents, there's a few hints and tips worth being aware of. First of all is if you're using these documents, keep them in your visual surveillance at all time, so you don't leave them sitting around. There are many horror stories of people leaving files in passenger seats of cars or on trains and so forth as they've read them, and they just don't do it. Other things is to keep documents in a storage container, and so if you're using it and you need to put it down for a moment, you put it into a container, and so you make sure that no one unauthorised would be able to look at it. And I guess the real thing is to make sure you return the documents back to where they should be after use. You don't leave it out for too long. And in the case of plans and graphs and charts and visual aids, I mean, they should also be labelled with codes, with code numbers, and not openly laying around with that could identify a particular project. So you wouldn't have project, project landscape in my garden. You would just put down project X, something along those lines as well. So you find a way to disguise those particular graphs and charts, so they can't be linked to any particular project, but from an outsider. Finally, document disposal. Obviously, one of the greatest things that people do is leave things on photocopying machines or in waste paper bins, particularly with the advent of recycling. Full documents are often just thrown into a recycling bin. Again, all those things become security risks to documents. So the best thing to do is always to be shredding documents, checking that you haven't left anything in your photocopying machines, and being mindful of where you've put everything. And try not to make too many copies of anything. Only make copies of what you absolutely need to. So look, a lot of that's probably a lot of 101 for many of you, and in your day-to-day working lives you probably have even more than I've just outlined. But the idea of this is I guess, for us learning to be mindful of that type of information, and that information has been entrusted in us, so we need to be sensitive to that. So that's some of the main areas that I wanted to cover in this topic. And to follow it up, have a look at the text, particularly chapter 22. It looks at some of the ethical issues of intelligence. It's worth reading. So does the following one, which looks at the ethics of intelligence collection. Both of them are ethics based. On the Interact side, I have a few video clips. I think about 3 there that look at collecting data, so that section. There's another one there on ethics again, and finally there's a little brief one on security. And the interesting one about that is they talk a lot about the way that security of company leaks of information or so forth often happens by employees' negligence. So it's only about 8 minutes, it's an interesting interview. And if you're wanting to focus your study, making sure that your work's moving along, I've got 4 sort of study questions for this section. Some of them are really just to get you thinking about ethics. So you'll notice there, the first 2 there, particularly, is there a limitation to applying ethics? That's really a question for you to answer, well, obviously, but also a question for you to answer in terms of what your position is and what it is that you're thinking about. The same with the second one. What are your concerns? That do you believe surveillance has gone too far? If yes, why? If not, why not? And what are the pros and cons for that? And finally, a couple of ones on how we deal with conflicting data, which we've covered in this topic, but we've also covered in previous topics as well. And finally, I've given some safeguards about documents and so forth. There's a lot of other information available that you can have a look at, and you can add to that list of safeguards that can be used for documents. So look, I hope that this has provided you with some signposting for further reading and so forth. I look forward to hearing some of your responses to the study questions, which you're welcome to post on the forum if you like. Again, these aren't accessible, really as a way to assist your overall learning experience. So again, as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via email or telephone. Thank you.